Good evening from New York, and good morning, Baghdad. It is already tomorrow in Iraq, which means that it is the end of America's Iraq war, which started there 7.5 years ago for this reason.
We know that Iraq and al-Qaeda have had high-level contacts that go back a decade. We've learned that Iraq has trained al-Qaeda members in bomb making, in poisons, and deadly gases.
Iraq has sent bomb-making and document forgery experts to work with al-Qaeda. Iraq has also provided al-Qaeda with chemical and biological weapons training.
He's a threat because he is dealing with al-Qaeda.
Iraq was linked to al-Qaeda and therefore to 9/11, and therefore we had to invade Iraq. None of that was true. And so when those rationales stopped passing the smell test, the Bush administration decided to sell the American people instead on another justification for invading Iraq.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction are controlled by a murderous tyrant who has already used chemical weapons to kill thousands of people.
We know he's been absolutely devoted to trying to acquire nuclear weapons.
Saddam Hussein has and is amassing weapons of mass destruction to use against America. That, of course, turned out to be bullpucky as well. Leading Bush administration war proponent Paul Wolfowitz conceded later that it was mostly for political convenience that the Bush administration decided to go with the whole WMD argument in the early stages of the war. Speaking from the White House briefing room on April 10th, 2003, Press Secretary Ari Fleischer said this: "Make no mistake, as I said earlier, we have high confidence that they have weapons of mass destruction. That is what this war was about and is about." No, it isn't, and no, it wasn't, ever. Once the war was well underway, even the Bush administration was forced to concede, reluctantly, that there weren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, whereupon the president decided to make it into a joke.
No weapons over there. Maybe under here.
That was just as hilarious at the time as it still is today, with more than 4,400 American lives to bolster the belly laughs. Ultimately, none of the things our government at the time told us were the reasons we had to start a war in Iraq were true. Opponents of the war said they thought that at the time, and pretty much everybody else realized it soon after things really got going in Iraq. So then after Iraq did 9/11, after Iraq has WMDs, after those, the justification for the war started to change even further. We needed a new, yet new, retroactive reason for why that war had to be waged.
The rise of a free and self-governing Iraq will deny terrorists a base of operation, discredit their narrow ideology, and give momentum to reformers across the region. The goal in Iraq and Afghanistan is for there to be democratic and free countries who are allies in the war on terror. That's the goal.
Spreading peace and democracy. That was the third try at made-up reasons why we invaded. Fourth try was perhaps the most remarkable. Remember this? That we had to invade because Saddam Hussein was gaming the UN Oil for Food program.
Saddam was systematically gaming the system, using the UN Oil for Food program to try to influence countries and companies in an effort to undermine sanctions. America is safer today with Saddam Hussein in prison.
That was really the most amazing one. President Bush, who went to war in defiance of the UN, went to war in Iraq in defiance of the UN, trying to retroactively convince us that really we only went to war against Iraq to protect the integrity of the UN Oil for Food program. We're just taking care of our buddies at the UN. In the end, after riffling through all of those different rationales for invading, the Bush administration pretty much settled on the lone justification that nobody could take issue with. The lone justification that Saddam Hussein was a bad man.
I sent American troops to Iraq to make its people free. Removing Saddam Hussein from power was the right decision. The men and women who crossed into Iraq 5 years ago removed a tyrant. liberated a country, and rescued millions from unspeakable horrors.
Nobody will dispute the fact that Saddam Hussein was, in fact, a bad man, an evil tyrant who murdered his own people, committed countless atrocities like lots of other bad men around the globe. It should also be noted that Saddam Hussein being a bad man had absolutely nothing to do with why we invaded Iraq. On the occasion of President Obama's Oval Office address tonight, a speech that marks the end of U.S. combat operations in Iraq, nobody, including the current president, seems to want to talk about exactly why we started this war in the first place. And that is maybe not surprising. This current president is a look forward, not look back kind of guy. But on the day the war ends, what the war was for is sort of the elephant in the room. As long as nobody talks about that touchy issue about what the war was for, congressional Republicans were actually more than eager to talk about Iraq today. But what they wanted to talk about was how President Obama should be thanking George W. Bush and apologizing for having opposed the surge that was supposedly what won this war in the end.
Some leaders who opposed, criticized, and fought tooth and nail to stop the surge strategy now proudly claim credit for the results.
In addition to House Republican leader John Boehner, who you saw there, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell also said today, quote, "I think we should also be thankful that another president had the determination and the will to carry out the plan that made tonight's announcement possible." And then there was this from Republican Senator John McCain, quote, "It would be nice if President Obama could finally find it in himself to give his predecessor the credit he deserves." The credit he deserves. While we are refusing to go down the memory hole here, can we just remember what the idea behind the surge was, why we did the surge in the first place? This is not an unknowable thing. The justifications for the surge, why we did the surge, all this stuff is on tape.
We will help this Iraqi government succeed. And the first step for success is to do something about the sectarian violence in Baghdad so they can have breathing space in order to do the political work necessary to assure the different factions in Baghdad, factions that are recovering from years of tyranny, that there is a hopeful future for them and their families. I would call that political breathing space.
Political breathing space. That was the justification for the surge. The point of the surge was to set up a political resolution in Iraq among Iraqi politicians to provide the breathing space necessary for a functioning government to be formed in Iraq. It has now been more than 5 months since Iraq held its last elections, and there is no government in Iraq. The surge strategy got a lot more attention than the agreement for U.S. troops to get out of Iraq next year that President Bush had to sign before he left office. So the surge strategy did provide some good political cover in that respect for President Bush. But in terms of the goal of the surge, a political settlement in Iraq, no, not yet. That has not happened. The war was started under the pretense that Iraq had some connection to 9/11 and al-Qaeda, which it didn't. Or that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which they didn't. Or that we were going to somehow democratize the Middle East by invading Iraq, which we didn't. Who knows? Maybe it really was all about stopping fraud in the UN Oil for Food program. I don't know. The surge strategy employed in 2007 in Iraq was about creating the political breathing space necessary for a political settlement in Iraq. That also has not happened. And yet the critics of President Obama today say that they want credit. They want credit for all that's transpired in Iraq in this war. Former Bush administration officials Paul Wolfowitz and John Bolton remarkably turned up in the op-ed pages today to make new suggestions about what they think should happen in Iraq, since, you know, their old advice was so spot on. Republicans arguing today that George W. Bush deserved to be thanked by name by President Obama tonight. Republicans are clamoring for credit here as this war finally ends. Well, credit where credit is due. 2 American things have been accomplished in Iraq. Tens of thousands, more than 1 million Americans served their country in a horrible war for 7.5 years under horrible circumstances and under political leadership that was not honest about why they had been sent there. Those Americans are to be honored for what they did and what they gave, and they are to be taken care of as veterans now that they're home. The other accomplishment in Iraq is that we have finally found a way to leave, to get combat troops out now. Those 2 accomplishments belong to this president, who is overseeing the withdrawal from Iraq, and to the people who served honorably for these 7.5 long years. Credit for all the rest of it for the made-up reasons for going in the first place, for letting Afghanistan spill out of control in favor of this war, for the constant revision of the justifications for war to obfuscate the craven, petty radicalism that really started it. Republicans, you guys can go right ahead and take that credit. Go right ahead. Credit where credit is due.